Hello everybody, this is John Druney, otherwise known as Goji73, here with the audio commentary for episode 12 of Godzilla and His Amazing Friends, entitled Geronimon Attacks, Part 1. This episode is the first two-parter in the series, as well as introduces the series villain, Geronimon. Much like the previous episodes, I will be providing you with some trivia about the episode, as well as what goes on in the episode, because this episode explains quite a few points in the series that are a bit crucial. So, of course, let's get started. Now, the opening you saw there with Geronimon coming in on Godzilla and his friends, he's basically spying on them and brooding because of some history I'll explain later in the audio commentary. And he doesn't attack Godzilla at that point because it would be futile, because Godzilla and his friends would pretty much beat the crap out of him. But also, I should go on to say that that scene is actually the first legitimate night scene I actually added in Godzilla and His Amazing Friends. I was rather against the idea of using nighttime battles because it's darker, but I thought I could get away with using the blue, quote, blue filter effect, because in most animes and cartoons, they usually put a blue filter over the characters to make it look dark out. So that's what I did there with that scene, and it turned out pretty good. I don't know if I'll be able to do it for the rest of the series, but if I do, expect it to look something like that. And I'm actually kind of proud of that scene, because it just turned out so well, and I'm not really a fan of using night scenes. So, one little tidbit there I should add. And thus, we are introduced to the characters. Now, what's going on in this scene is that Godzilla, Anguirus, and Rodan, who is off-screen, are going to play by the lake. And they stumble into Gomora, and they're asking if Gomora wants to join them in playing with them. Gomora, however, refuses and walks away. Godzilla feels disappointed by this, while his friends comfort him and reassure him to go play in the lake anyways, because Gomora doesn't hang out with them. Now, the reason for this being is we start to see a little bit more into Gomora's personality here. Because if you remember back in episode 2, as well as all the other ones like episode 4, 7, and 10, I believe, we see that Gomora does not like to really hang out with Godzilla and friends so much. Because essentially, for those of you who have been watching the series, Gomora is sort of the lone wolf. He's a loner who keeps himself away from Godzilla and his friends because he feels that when Godzilla spared his life in their first battle, that it destroyed him of his pride. Because with monsters, they're always fighting on Monster Island, and when Gomora pretty much attacked Godzilla to prove he's powerful, and the fact that Godzilla was able to beat him so easily in their first episode fight, it shows that Gomora believes he's weak, and by being spared is a disgrace to being alive, not realizing that Godzilla is willing to take him in as a friend, much like he has with with Rodan and Anguirus. And Gomora feels that he can't really be at peace because he's so conflicted, like he's been shown compassion by Godzilla, but at the same time, he thinks that's somewhat of a wrong thing. And while he's thinking that, out comes the series villain, Geronimon. Now, first off, before I get into Geronimon's personality here, there is one upcoming scene where you see a flashback of him looking at Gomora. The reason why Geronimon attacks him in this scene is because he recognizes Gomora as a friend of Godzilla, and because Geronimon has a hatred for Godzilla, he wants to pretty much kill out all of his friends, leaving Godzilla only for himself. Because without all of Godzilla's friends, Godzilla would probably be overpowered by Geronimon's abilities. Now, speaking of abilities, the reason why I've chosen Geronimon as the series villain is because out of all the monsters that have appeared in the Ultra series so far, one that has not been given a really, really big push is Geronimon. I mean, when you think about it, here's a monster who can revive the dead and control the dead. That's pretty much like it's pretty much Godzilla in Shang Tsung or it's pretty much Shang Tsung in a Godzilla suit. So I've had to switch that around, but essentially that's what Geronimon is, sort of, in this series. He's a chief of the monsters, and in comparison to Godzilla, he is actually weaker and relies on his special abilities to fight back, whereas Godzilla is very versatile. He is both strong and has pretty strong abilities that can counteract an opponent, whereas Geronimon solely revives on his abilities and is actually physically much more weaker. Hence why you're seeing him getting his ass kicked by Gomora in these scenes. So, and with that being said in mind about him being like essentially a Shang Tsung of monsters, that's pretty much a pretty big influence I placed on Geronimon for this scene. Because in his episode appearance, they don't really explain how he's able to revive the dead. So with this scene here, with him reviving King, I actually took this influence of Shang Tsung's ability to revive the dead in the original Mortal Kombat, or the newest Mortal Kombat if you've been paying attention to that series. And so I pretty much sort of added my own flavor to Geronimon. Because, yeah, he's the villain, and he's barely had any sort of screen time apart from his first appearance in Ultraman and Ultraman Fighting Evolution Rebirth. So, and speaking of abilities, the incarnation of Geronimon I'm sort of focusing on here is the Rebirth Geronimon, because as you saw there with that purple superpower he fired from his hands, that is an ability he keeps in the video games, whereas all the others are his own, minus the resurrection scene, because that was just my interpretation of how he does that. Also, this scene right here with King, you'll notice that this is the Max King, whereas I used the original Yellow King in episode 3. The reason for this is sort of like a double entree. It's essentially, this King right now is actually the same King that fought Godzilla in episode 3. But the reason why I chose a different one was because the blue King from Ultraman Max just gives him a much more undead appearance. Because whereas the yellow one looks a lot more chubby, this one looks thin and almost zombie-esque and bluish, as you can see by all the cracks that cover his body. So I figured I would use the Max one, both to please the fans and to give off a dead effect for King, since he is pretty much undead at this point. And also we get on to the trickiest part of Geronimon's character, his Feather Spear ability, or Feather Shuriken, as I've been hearing it. I do want to implement this ability, but this scene right here with Gomora being sliced by the feathers, this is actually the hardest effect to do with Geronimon, because there are so many layers that need to be done to put the film together. So, it's very creative, and I'm actually proud of myself for putting it together, but it's also one of the much more trickier ones, too. And also that scene there with Gomora is basically the feathers are cutting him up, and he's trying to fight him off, but there are so many that he can't really bat them all away. He's like being surrounded by razor-sharp bees, if you'd like to put it at that. And Godzilla and his friends hear the call, and they try and help Gomora. And basically, Gomora is pretty much being beaten to near death by King here, because the feathers sliced him up, and he's about to be paralyzed by King with his lightning. So basically, even on his own, Gomora does need help, and his pride is sort of getting in the way of him. And his conflicted pride is sort of weakening him, if you get what I mean. Because with all of his appearances, he's always saved Godzilla, but he's never actually fought a monster on his own. So I just wanted to give off that Gomora, being a loner, doesn't realize that even if he feels he's strong, he can't really beat these fights on his own. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And also I should address this thing here with King. If you notice by this one scene of him being killed by Godzilla's ray, you'll notice that it only took one ray to kill King here, whereas it took a bunch to kill him in his first appearance. The thing I wanted to show here is that even though Geronimon has the ability to revive dead monsters, is that all of the monsters he revives are all basically much, much more weaker than their original forms. And you'll see this later on in episode 13 when I get there. But as you saw with King, it was just, he was killed so easily by Godzilla's ray, because essentially he's a zombie, so he's weaker than his prime self. And here we have Godzilla and his friends saving Gomora from being hurt any further, and rescued by Godzilla and his friends to show that even though they don't hang out that much, Godzilla does value the friendship he acquires with the other monsters. So that's what that scene is there, to show that he does care for the others. And even here, when Geronimon endangers Anguirus and Rodan with the feathers, Godzilla saves them by destroying them. And thus, I believe we can get into this. Godzilla and Geronimon's history, I believe. What else should I cover? Sorry. This is a bit of a lull here. Basically, what Godzilla and Geronimon's history here is that Godzilla and Geronimon are sort of like really bad blood. Prior to the events of the series that we see, something happened between Godzilla and Geronimon that Godzilla will never forgive him for, and which Geronimon had done. And so, thus we are taken to Godzilla telling Anguirus and Rodan to leave so that he can have Geronimon on his own. And you can see here, like, there's hesitation in Anguirus because he's concerned for Godzilla. And unknown to them, which I'll explain to see episode 3, or episode 13, sorry, is, well, you'll find out then. Here's a really nice effect I really like doing here. The squaring off, like, what you is sort of, it's not completely taken from Final Wars, because I've seen this in like other animes too. That squaring off effect, looks tricky, but it's actually pretty simple when you actually execute it. And yeah, I just thought I could mention that there. And another side of Geronimon you could see is that even though he can revive the monsters of the dead, he has no concern for them, because even though we assume that King is alive, Geronimon has no regards for him, and so uses King as a decoy to distract Godzilla while he goes in and attacks him. Also, this breath scene here, even though it's slightly delayed, what I was trying to get across is that it does work after a while, but it does take a while to make to affect the monsters, like you saw with Godzilla there. And as you're seeing here, like I said, Geronimon is weaker, and thus it gives Godzilla the advantage he needs to pretty much beat the crap out of him, because he's physically weaker than many of the other monsters. And as I said, getting back onto Godzilla and Geronimon's rivalry, yes, they have a really bad blood for each other for what has happened between the two, which will be seen later on in the series. And Geronimon's prime goal is to get rid of Godzilla, or to kill off his friends one by one, so that way he could have Monster Island for himself. So basically it's a battle for power type of scenario, but with deeper meaning as the series will progress. And maybe one more thing I should cover, because we're winding down on the episode a little bit, is that for those of you who were paying attention to the series about a year ago, you'll notice that I had put up a poll around this time to ask which monster was your favorite that appeared in the series. Well, the reason for that being was because, as a treat to everybody who has been watching my series, I asked which was your favorite because the top 3 monsters were going to serve as Geronimon's hench monsters that appear in episode 13, and there they are right now. The winners were Golza, Bemular, and Kelbeam. And it's surprising because, well, Golza had a landslide of voters, and Kelbeam and Bemular actually came in second. So, yeah, if you still remember back to that poll contest, yeah, essentially the reason why I put up that poll was because I wanted to see which monsters were you guys' favorites, so that way I could bring them back for like fan service for this final attack, or not final attack, but you get what I mean. Assault against Godzilla. to leave a cliffhanger for episode 13 because, like I said, this is my first two-parter, and it's just my way of saying thank you for supporting the series. And with that being said, this just about does it for episode 12. Look forward to episode 13 being posted on December 24th. See you later till then.